Not every worthwhile car from the 1970s Australian market found the audience it deserved. 10 of the decade's most underrated, counting from 10 to 1. The one at the very top was Ford's most thoroughly appointed Australian-built car of the decade, extended wheelbase, V8, Ghia specification, and has been almost invisible from the record since production ended. That one is still ahead. Number 10. Ford Escort TF, 1975 to 1980. The Escort story in Australia was told almost entirely at the practical end of its capabilities. Ford assembled the TF here with a 1.3 or 1.6-litre Kent four-cylinder, priced it for buyers who needed something manageable and economical, and it sold in those terms without difficulty. What the nameplate was carrying underneath that presentation was a rally heritage built in Europe through the early 1970s that had almost no bearing on how the car was discussed in an Australian showroom. The Escort's front-engine rear-drive layout and its light, direct character made it more rewarding to drive than its price suggested, something buyers who took one onto a decent road occasionally discovered and then had no ready framework to place. There was no established conversation in the Australian market for a budget car with genuine driver character. The next car was underrated in a more specific way. Its quality was right there to see, and still largely went unacknowledged. Number 9. Chrysler VK Valiant, 1975 to 1976. The Valiant lineage ran across more than 15 years of Australian production, and its variations have been discussed at different lengths by the people who follow that history. The VK is the one that comes up least. Built at Tonsley Park in Adelaide, with the 245 cubic inch Hemi 6 available as a sedan, wagon, and utility, the VK bridged the VJ and the CL across roughly 18 months of production. Buyers who chose one in 1975 or 1976 got a Valiant at the mature end of its platform's development. The Hemi 6, thoroughly proven by then, the engineering well understood, and the car reliable in the particular way the Tonsley Park product had spent years earning. Nobody told those buyers the production run was short enough to make a genuine VK, considerably rarer today than anyone had reason to anticipate. Short runs become significant in retrospect. They never announce themselves while they're happening. The next car's underrated quality was more obvious, and just as easily missed. Number 8. Toyota Celica TA22. 1971 to 1977. Toyota's standing in Australia in the early 1970s was built on reliability and price, the Corolla providing the evidence, the Corona reinforcing it. What the TA22 Celica proposed was a different question, whether Toyota could build a genuine sports coupe that competed on its own terms rather than on economy credentials. In the GT specification, the 2TG twin-cam engine answered that clearly, more complex, higher revving, and more willing than anything in the standard Toyota range, with a character that made the distinction between the base Celica and the GT an unmistakable thing from the driver's seat. In Australian showrooms, the TA22 sat alongside the Corona and the Corolla, and was read by most buyers as the stylish coupe in the Toyota range, rather than as a fundamentally different kind of machine. The buyers who drove the GT and compared it directly with Datsun and Mazda sporting alternatives at similar prices understood clearly where it stood. Most of the market was still addressing Toyota for economy reasons and wasn't receptive to this kind of argument yet. The next car made an equally pointed case from an even less expected direction. Number 7. Mazda RX-2, 1971 to 1977. The Mazda rotary story in Australia was written by the RX-3 and then closed definitively by the RX-7. The RX-2 was in Australian showrooms before both of them, a larger, more settled coupe with the 12A twin-rotor Wankel engine and a character closer to a refined touring car than a sports car in everyday use. The 12A's defining quality is an engine that builds revs smoothly and freely without a distinct power band, and in the RX-2, that quality was expressed in a quiet, composed context that suited buyers who wanted the engineering distinction without the performance intent. When the RX-3 arrived and the Mazda rotary narrative in Australia became attached to competition results and outright performance, the RX-2 lost the thread of the story entirely. It never recovered its own identity once that happened. The cars that survive are owned by people who sought them out specifically, not people who remember them from the general experience of the decade. The next car ended without the recognition it had earned. Number 6. Triumph TR6. 1969 to 1976. The TR6 was available in Australia in right-hand drive, with a 2.5-litre straight-six that had been building toward its final form since the TR2 first appeared in the early 1950s. On Australian roads in the early and mid-1970s, it offered something the domestic alternatives and the smaller Japanese coupes couldn't approximate: the character of the traditional British roadster in its most fully developed expression. Wide cockpit, long bonnet, the six pulling cleanly from low revs, and a directness from the steering that expected the driver to be present rather than insulated. When Triumph ended TR6 production in 1976, it closed the chapter on that specific formula. The TR7 that replaced it moved in a different direction entirely, and was never entirely forgiven by the buyers who had valued what came before it. The Australian buyers who collected the last TR6s from dealers were completing a purchase with no particular awareness of what was being completed alongside it. The next car was equally quiet about its own significance, halfway through. From here, the cars on this list were making arguments the decade mostly declined to receive clearly. The one at number 1 made the most complete argument of all, and found the smallest audience relative to what it was. Still ahead, number 5, Chrysler Valiant Charger 770, 1971 to 1978. The Charger's reputation was built entirely by the E49, and that reputation has held. What it achieved in the process was the near-total erasure of the 770 from the car's public identity. The 770 was the fully specified luxury variant of the Charger body, the same fastback lines produced at Tonsley Park in Adelaide, the same genuinely distinctive coupe form that has no close equivalent elsewhere in the Australian market of the period, fitted for the buyer who wanted refinement rather than the performance the E49 represented. The 245 Hemi 6 in touring configuration, full interior specification, and the visual presence of a car that looked like nothing else on the road, without the racing implications the performance variants carried. The buyers who chose the 770 made a deliberate decision about what the Charger body was actually for. The historical record rendered that decision invisible behind the E49 narrative. The next car was invisible for a completely different reason. The buyers who chose it had no way of knowing what they were actually carrying home. Number 4. BMW 2002, 1968 to 1976. The 2002 introduced a concept to the Australian market that the domestic manufacturers hadn't pursued and the Japanese importers weren't attempting. A compact car built specifically around the experience of driving it. A 2.0-litre four-cylinder in a car weighing under a ton on a rear-wheel drive chassis, where driver feedback was a specific engineering objective rather than a side effect. The Australian buyers who found the 2002 through the decade, through the enthusiast press, through word of mouth from someone who had driven one overseas, through a comparison test that placed it alongside larger and more expensive alternatives, were making a decision without much local framework to support it. The proposition that a small European rear-drive car with a specific driver intent was worth choosing over a Holden or a Falcon was not an established idea in Australia at the time. Those buyers formed that opinion independently, and in doing so built the foundation of a BMW reputation in Australia that the 3 Series later carried forward, and the brand has held since. The next car made an equally advanced argument in a language almost no one in Australia could read at the time. Number 3. Honda Civic, from 1974 in Australia. The buyers who chose a first-generation Civic in Australia came for economy and reliability. Both arrived without drama. What did not arrive in any Australian showroom conversation about the Civic was the significance of the CVCC combustion technology Honda had developed for it. Compound vortex-controlled combustion, a stratified charge design that allowed the Civic's 1.5-litre engine to meet the United States Clean Air Act's 1975 emissions standards without a catalytic converter. When those standards were being set, Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors had each argued to Congress that achieving them within the specified timeframe was technically impossible. Honda met them with a small displacement engine in a budget economy car and made no particular fuss about it in the process. The achievement reached engineering literature, but not Australian showroom floors. The buyers who took delivery of a Civic in 1975 were in possession of the decade's most demonstrably advanced production combustion engineering, with no particular reason to know it. The next car's achievement is more visible from the outside, which makes the lack of attention it has received since even harder to account for. Number 2. Holden HQ Monaro GTS, 1971 to 1974. The HK launched the Monaro legend, and legends stay where they first land. The HQ Monaro GTS has been living in the original's shadow for more than 50 years, despite being the more developed and more refined expression of the same formula. The new HQ platform brought more comprehensively resolved engineering than the series it replaced. The Monaro on that platform carried the 308 cubic inch V8, a more sophisticated ride than the HT or HG had offered, quieter manners at highway speed, and interior quality built to a measurably higher standard than the earlier cars managed. A buyer who chose an HQ Monaro GTS in 1972 or 1973 got a better car than the one that started the nameplate story. The prices those cars have returned at auction over the decades consistently reflect the original's priority, regardless of the quality case that can be made for the HQ. That is how legends work. The car at number 1 was overshadowed not by a predecessor, but by a different variant of itself. Number 1. Ford ZH Fairlane Ghia, 1976 to 1979. Ford built the ZH Fairlane at Broadmeadows in Victoria on an extended version of the XC Falcon platform, a longer wheelbase that delivered rear seat accommodation, genuinely different in scale from the standard Falcon, not just marginally more of the same. The Ghia specification placed the highest fitment level Ford Australia offered onto that extended body: 302 cubic inch Cleveland V8, power windows, full luxury interior, and a formal roofline that positioned the car at a different address from anything else in the range. A buyer comparing a ZH Fairlane Ghia with a European executive import in 1977 had an honest argument to make for the locally built Ford: more interior space, comparable luxury specification, engineering better suited to Australian conditions, and a substantially lower price than crossing the world demanded. Some buyers made that comparison and chose the Ghia. They drove it through the late 1970s and into the following decade without it becoming a story that era chose to tell about itself. The XC Cobra absorbed the XC platform's narrative entirely, and the ZH Fairlane Ghia, on the same bones at the opposite end of every intention that platform expressed, was left without a chapter in what the decade said about Ford in Australia. It does not appear at car shows with any regularity. It does not surface in conversations about what 1970s Australian motoring produced at its most complete. The distance between what it was, the most thoroughly appointed Australian-built car Ford produced in the decade, and what the record says about it, is the widest silence this list contains. These 10 were built for buyers who paid close attention, or who made decisions based on what a car actually offered rather than what a badge had established. Some found those buyers, some found too few. The standard account of 1970s Australian motoring is shorter than the decade deserves. These 10 are part of the longer version. What's the most underrated car from this era you've driven or owned, or the one you think should have been higher on this list? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if Australian motoring history is what brought you here, a like and a subscribe to Sunburnt Chrome keeps it coming.